Hi, this is Misha, and I really don't have a specific point to this video. I just had all my milled AKs out. I recently acquired a couple of new ones, and so my collection, my arrangement of the different variations from the different nationalities is as complete as it's ever going to be. There are some guns that are just virtually unobtainium, even in parts kit form, or just so expensive that it's out of my range. But this is what I've got, so I thought we would just kind of show them all together and compare and contrast the similarities and the differences, and talk about semi-auto options. Starting on the left, we have my Russian AK Type 3. This one appears in a number of videos because it's cool and I like bringing it out. Then we have a Hungarian AK47. This is one of the SLR 100 builds done by MSC back 15 or so years ago. This, by the way, is on a firing line receiver, and it was done about 10 years ago. Then we have a pre-banned Polytech AK47S, always known as the Legend. It's one of the few actual pre-banned available AK Type 3 style guns. Next we have another SLR 100 style build. This is a Polish KBKG WZ 1960. Then we have a Finnish Valmet M62S. This is another pre-ban. May not look like an AK Type 3, but it really is. At least a good chunk of it. This is the semi version of the RK62, Finland's standard issue for the last 50 plus years. Then we have a Yugoslavian Zastava M70. This is a reweld from a kit. Then we have a Bulgarian AKS. This is the underfolding version. This is a slightly modernized style that they started doing in the late 80s, early 90s. Specifically, this is one of the Arsenal SAS M7 classics that I've changed around a little bit to be representative of a military gun from the late 80s, as I said. And then we'll wrap things up on this video with this riffle here. This is my Arsenal SAM7, SAM7 SF, kind of jokingly referred to these days as the game changer because of Arsenal's promotion of it 4 years ago. And it's dressed up and configured like an AR M9F, which is one of Arsenal's current military select fire offering guns, still on a milled receiver. So this is really about as up-to-date and modern of a milled gun as you're going to find. So with this being still offered in 2017, let's zip back to the original gun from 1947. Now, I'm not going to get too deep into the history and stuff here because we have individual videos talking about each nationality and things, so for that, really check that out. This is really just to compare and contrast these. As I said, this is a Russian kit built on a firing line receiver. This is one of the ones that came out of Israel, the PLO kits. Where to begin? Well, Kalashnikov began working on his design that would evolve into the AK at the end of World War II. There was an original round of prototypes known as the AK-46. Then there was the AK-47 prototypes, which were developed in very late 1947. Well, I should say they were finalized in 1947, adopting quite a few changes that the original trials kind of suggested. And as is pretty well known, the first AK-47s, both prototype and production, weren't on a milled receiver. They were on a stamped receiver, quite thick stamped steel, with machined front trunnions for the bolt to lock into. There was another prototype series known as the AK-48 with even more changes, but the Soviets went with the AK-47 platform, tinkered with it a bit. It really kind of left Kalashnikov's direct control after it was selected, and then went into production at the Izhevsk factory in 1949 with, again, the early stamped receiver. However, there were various problems. Again, look at our history video for that. But, you know, they went to a machine receiver. They started playing with it in 1950, and they received the go-ahead to put the machine receiver into production late that year, and it would go into production the following year, 51. This would be what we know today as the AK Type 2, was really the first production milled AK. Now, the AK Type 2 was very similar to this here, which is mostly an AK Type 3, and there were transitional guns. Basically, the AK Type 1 on the stamped receiver and the AK Type 2 on the milled were identical guns, except for the receiver change. The AK Type 2 did have a different rear section. The idea they were trying to do was so they could use both a folding and a fixed stock receiver template without having to change it out. Well, in the end, this didn't work. It worked, but I mean, productions. They made some other changes, and this transitioned over to the AK Type 3, and there was a transitional period where they would use up old parts. In fact, this one has some. The stock set is actually a late AK Type 2 style, solid wood with a smooth pistol grip. And with the Type 3 receiver, we have a top tang and a bottom tang separate with its own receiver. They're machined to it here. And the underfolder would have a completely different rear section. The Type 2, it was more interchangeable. You could use the same base receiver for either underfolding or fixed. Now we'll look at that Bulgarian down there, an AKS, original milled underfolding stock, in here in a bit. But it was really kind of taken from the German MP40, and it only locked on one side and was made from tubular machined steel. The fixed stock is interesting compared to later AKMs because it actually comes down at more of a sweep. This was kind of a common style for machine guns of the era. The Thompson is a good example. It was just what they did. Well, in Russia, they would keep making the AK Type 3. Starting in 53, moving into 54, some sources kind of argue as to when the Type 3 really replaced the 2, but in that era. And again, transitional. Until about 1958, 1959, it was replaced by the AKM on a Type 4 receiver, which is a return to a stamped. So it was in production relatively briefly in Russia. However, being communism in the huge factories they had, they cranked out a lot of these suckers in a short period of time. Of course, this is your standard AK original. We'll walk it through once. The rest of these are going to pretty much share most all of these features. We have a medium heavy profile barrel that is 16 1/4 inches long. This one is chrome lined, as most production models would be. It also has a long stroke. Gas piston is attached to the carrier. It's not readily removable. We have a contained recoil spring in the back. This has a Type 2 dust cover, so it's very heavy gauge stamped steel because it's really a carryover from the Type 1. Very heavy steel. The barrel is screwed into the receiver. It's a very traditional rifle making method. As I said, we have solid wood handguards, Russia would switch over to laminated wood. 55, 56. It was stronger, better to, better resistant to soldier. It was more soldier proof, I should say. And it was easier to make, I suppose, in a mass production setting. Ditto for the wood pistol grips. This is why they would disappear when the AKM came out and they would go to a polymer grip or a Bakelite. Interestingly, the bayonet is almost an afterthought on these. We don't have a lug here. This is just a loop for the cleaning rod. We have a little cutout area here under the sight base. The bayonet just snaps on here and then goes around the barrel. And it's simply a blade bayonet. It doesn't double of much of anything else, and it's not even really a good utility knife. It's just a bayonet. Like I said, it's almost an afterthought. The muzzle is threaded 14 by 1 left hand, which is quite common today because of the AK's success. And originally we would just have simply a muzzle butt, a thread protector on these guns. We have a ported gas tube. A lot of you who have more modern AKM types will notice that there are ports on your gas block, but originally we would have ports on the tube. This is to vent off excess gas after the piston head leaves this area. It lets off gas pressure, so we're not just slamming the bolt group against the back of the receiver. It's kind of a self-regulating system, if you will. The sling swivel is up here on the gas block and back here on the receiver. Interestingly, earlier production, Type 1, Type 2 guns would have the swivel here on the handguard retainer and here on the buttstock. And that's where they would return to with the AKM. So kind of a lot of back and forth. This is a solid milled receiver, blued Finnish gun. We have lightning cuts on both sides. Still a pretty heavy gun, but solid feeling, smooth. We have a double hook trigger group. You know the drill. This was the Russian pattern. There are no true import semi-auto Russian AKs with the milled receiver. All of the ones here are kit builds of one form or another. Some are built on US receivers, like this one. More recently, rewelding has become popular using the original stubs. But when I did this one, when this one was made, that wasn't, again, as I've said in the videos, I'm sure people were rewelding, but it wasn't a common thing and you just didn't hear much about it. So back in the day when these PLL kits were coming in, most people would build them on firing line or other US receivers. And these would be originally built with these 30-round slab side mags made of very heavy gauge stamped steel. Later they would go to the more common patterns we know today. These would stay in service even though they were out of production by the 60s in Russia for a good long period of time. Alright, so moving on to our variants. This is a Hungarian AK-55, or rather a kit built on to a Bulgarian milled receiver. Hungary would first try out the Soviet gun, wanting to replace older Mosin Nagants and submachine guns with a more modern weapon, and designated the AK-55 for the year of 1955. The FEG factory would tool up and go into production in 1959, and between that year and 1963, they would produce, again, quite a large number. These would remain in service even though they were pretty quickly phased out in production by a modern AKM variant, the AKM63. So much so that they were refurbished in the early 70s to either keep in reserve in Hungary or to give to communist allies or rebels. The Hungarian guns are such a close copy of the Russian AK Type 3 that for a long time people have speculated that some of the parts might actually be virgin Russian parts. More recent years this kind of theory has been shot down a bit, but either way they did a very good job of replicating the Russian gun quality wise. The barrel's exactly the same, the whole assembly. Originally these would have been blued, just like the Russians, with the bolt carrier in the white. Really the only big difference would be the furniture. The Hungarian furniture is a bit of its own pattern. Handguards have a little bit different contour. They're made from beechwood, as is the buttstock. And the Hungarian pistol grips would be kind of large and checkered affairs. To be fair, Russia would also do checkered pistol grips for a time, but Hungary would keep on. These guns were assembled at the FEG factory, who made most of the parts. However, they did not make the receiver or the stock, the furniture. This was outsourced to a subcontractor. But the quality is well respected on the Hungarian guns. As far as the semi-auto build, quite a few AK-55 kits came in around 2000 to 2003-04. And Inner Arms sold them and contracted them out to be built by various companies. This one, for example, was built by MSC. The majority were built by Gordon Tech, with a smaller number by Blue Ridge. And these were built on Bulgarian receivers. That's why this has a pressed and pinned in barrel rather than screw in. So that's not original. And that's also why it lacks a sling swivel on the back. There are plenty of Hungarian kit rewelds out there. There are also plenty of homemade builds. But as far as a factory mass production example, this is about as close as you're going to get. At least the receiver's an original military grade receiver made in a former Comblock factory, and the parts on this one are all matching Hungarian, including the barrels original to the kit. Since these were made during the ban, it has a muzzle nut tack welded on. And they very, very half-assedly tried to machine off the prongs for the bayonet lug. They didn't do it. There's still plenty of meat there to lock a bayonet on just fine. You can see us putting one on in our video about the SLR 100H series. It's a really interesting story how these were made. So if you're interested, yeah, check that out. But they were very good guns. And even though FEG only made them for 4, maybe 5 years, they stayed in service for a long time, and then quite a few were given away, and they will turn up in various parts of the world. So some kits will be in mint condition, others will be pretty well used. But it's a very close copy of the Soviet. And here is another close copy. As I said, this is a pre-ban Chinese Polytech AK47S, known today as the Legend. And this is really the only option if you want a pre-ban AK Type 3 gun. As with many of the other communist nations, China was interested in the AK Type 3 to replace its older guns. After the revolution in 1949, the Communist Army found itself with just a huge range of guns: Mausers, Mosins, US equipment, Soviet equipment, German equipment, pretty much everything equipment. And so in the 50s they wanted to consolidate. First they started making the Mosin Nagant under license as the Type 53, then the Tokarev pistol, first as the Type 51 and then the Type 54. And next they would move on to the SKS and the AK Type 3, both of which they would adopt as the Type 56. This was the Type 56 assault rifle or infantry rifle. The SKS would be the Type 56 carbine. Confusing enough? By the way, Hungary would never manufacture the SKS, just for clarity's sake. The first Chinese guns would be built in China under Soviet supervision, using Soviet parts. They basically just send all the parts over and they would finish them out in China. And the Russians would kind of watch the Chinese, show them how to do things. And as the decade would wear on, more and more parts would be made in China. and then the Soviet advisors would leave. But definitely by 1959, 1960, they were all Chinese. Most likely, probably by 1958, really. But, you know, in the early Type 56 Chinese guns were exact copies of the Soviet. And that's where this semi-auto comes from here. It was an attempt in the 80s to make a reproduction of the first generation of Type 56 to appeal to collectors. We have a 16-inch barrel, same hardware, same bayonet lug up here, ported gas tube. We have, of course, hardwood handguards. Some of these would be more of a blonde, some more of a red color. We have a machined receiver. Now, one concession to modernity that China made, they did a press and pin barrel instead of a screw-in with the legends. Another was they went to a 3-rivet trigger guard rather than the original 5. And they used a stamped mag release instead of the original machined. But they still are doing the checkered pistol grip, which is good. The downswept wooden buttstock with storage compartment for the cleaning kit. And they did at least put the sling swivel on the side of the gun, which I appreciate. And they blued the guns, similar to original, and left the bolt carrier in the white. They even used the original style of double hook trigger. Now, if people think of the Chinese Type 56, they probably don't think of this exact version. That's because China would make some changes. Around 1960, they would go to the hooded front sight, which they still use today. And then in 1965, 1966, they would add an underfolding spike bayonet, at least as an option. Now that look, folding bayonet, hooded front sight, milled receiver, is a very common Vietnam look. But really it was only made for a few years. Starting in 67, they would go to a new pattern of stamped receiver, 1.5 millimeter as opposed to the milled. But otherwise the gun would be unchanged. This is why the Chinese Type 56 with the stamped receiver has more AK Type 3 features than it does AKM. Because basically they just took this exact gun and they put a stamped receiver on it. This is because they never had a license to produce the AKM. By the mid-60s, Sino-Soviet relations were falling apart. It's actually why relations between China and America improved dramatically in the 70s. These were made at several factories. They began at Factory 66 in the 50s. They would soon start making them at Factory 56, as well as Factory 386 and 416 and others. So this is why it took several years to switch completely over from machine receivers, milled receivers, to stamped. But by 1970, the transition was made. So by the 70s in China, at least for their military, they were no longer doing the machined receiver guns. They brought them back in the 80s for the US collector market, including this gun here. And Polytech would send over a reasonably large number from about 87 through 89. And again, this is really as good as you're going to get for a pre-ban if you want it, even though it has a few concessions to being a modern production gun. Also, China, well, really, I should say no one did the slab side mag except Russia. They all went to the ribbed mags. China originally would do the standard Soviet ribbed mag pattern, but soon they would go to this flat back style. And there's several minor variations of that. These guns would actually see quite a bit of combat, of course in Vietnam and elsewhere, and China would make them in the millions. Next to Russia, China probably made the most. Definitely a neat variant, and very close to the original. Moving on, this is a very similar build story to that AK-55. Poland would get interested in the AK at the same time as Hungary, 1955. They would purchase some guns from Russia, decided they liked them. Originally they were going to make both the AK and the SKS, but the following year they changed their mind and just wanted to make the AK. There was a little bit of back and forth, but finally Russia acquiesced and production began in limited numbers in 57 as the FB, or today FB, Radom. Then it was Luxnick, Circle 11, Factory 11, Radom Factory would begin, and by 58 they were in full production of the fixed stock version. Originally it was adopted as the PMK, and it was a very, very close copy of the Russian gun again, much like the Hungarian. Had all the same features, including blued finish. They would use hardwood furniture originally. In 58, they would adopt an underfolding version, which was basically just called the PMK underfolding. I forgot to mention on the Chinese, the underfolding version, guys, is the Type 56-1. Sorry. Anyway, they would do that. Full production then. Interestingly, they would change the name around 1959 to KBK AK. And they would try several variations on the machine receiver, including a DMR version, LMG version, so on and so forth. They played around with it. In 1960, they would introduce this version here, the KBKG, known as the WZ 1960, or just WZ 1960. This was a dedicated grenade launching version. Originally, it was identical to the KBK, except it had a barrel that was slightly contoured differently, kind of cone-shaped at the front to taper down to fit well with a grenade launcher spigot. It also has an enlarged detent pin, so it's easy to unscrew the nut or unscrew the spigot. Standard bayonet lug. Gas cutoff here for launching grenades. Standard gas tube otherwise. We would have an attachable grenade launcher rear sight that goes over this. It sits in a kit. We would have a lock on the dust cover to keep it from flying off, which is probably a good thing. And we would have these brackets on the stock, one here, one on the other side, to support a rubber boot for launching grenade. Also, the original KBK had the sling swivel on the back of the receiver here in a normal spot. However, the KBKG had it on the bottom of the stock, at least the ones I've seen, looking at original kits and just stocks from RTG. So they moved the swivel to more of an AKM position, or if you like, an AK Type 1, Type 2 position. I'm sure they had their reasons, probably to do with launching rifle grenades. They would also issue these when they were launching grenades with short 10-round mags. Now, originally these guns would be blued with hardwood furniture, but as they were refurbished in the 70s, they would paint them, and they would acquire laminate wood if the original wood was beat up. So that's why this one's the way it is. And also the wood pistol grips would get replaced by Bakelite. Radom would continue manufacturing the standard KBK until it was replaced by the AKM in 1966. But they would keep the KBKG grenade launcher in limited production and refurbish already existing examples until around 1972, and they would not actually officially start to go out of service until 74. They didn't really want to use the original stamped AKM there for grenade launching. They wanted to keep using the milled, at least until they developed the 1974 underbarrel grenade launcher for the stamp guns. The reason I brought this out and the reason I own this as opposed to just a Polish KBK AK, again, the original Polish KBK AK looks just like all the others we've already got on the couch. This one's a little bit different of a variant. That's why it has a Polish year designation, because they made enough changes and it's their own pattern. I just think it's interesting. They would not make many of these. Of the grenade launchers, it seems like it was around 5,500. They did not have a underfolding stock version of the grenade launcher, although they did of the KBK. But instead, in 1972, they would put into limited production a quick detaching stock version, which had a stock that looked identical to this, but it had two buttons, two spring-loaded buttons you could press to pull the stock off for paratrooper airborne use. So that's kind of interesting. But they didn't make but about 500 of those. Again, very specialized variant. As for the semi-autos, again, there's no pre-ban Polish AKs at all. Between about 1999 and 2001, Gordon Tech would build 500-600 of these using the Arsenal receivers. Some under contract from Arsenal USA, others just on their own initiative with Inner Arms imported milled receivers. They do have the concession, as most guns, with the pressed and pinned barrel. But they did use a very original style paint finish for at least a Polish refurb, and did a very good job of manufacturing these guns. So if you want a KBKG, and aside from a kit build, a custom kit build, but this is still a kit build, I should say, but aside from a custom job, this is really a great option. They did a fantastic job on these. These are very smooth and well done, and they didn't neuter them much. Like this one still has the bayonet lug unmachined off. The original muzzle nut was tack welded on, but very lightly. They even shipped these usually with all the grenade launching goodies, which was neat. Other than that batch from the early 2000s, Century Arms manufactured the 1960 Sporter from around 2008, guys, I think, up to about 2013, 2012, 2013. Smaller and smaller numbers. So quite a few of the Polish kits were used by Century. The Century guns, though, would not have the original barrels like this one does, and they'd be built on Century receivers that are milled style, but they're cast, and then they're milled final shape. Most of them were just the KBK AK, but a few were of the WZ 1960 grenade launching variant. You can find a few of the Century guns with some or all of the features, including the gas cutoff and the dust cover lock. So those are a little bit collectible or desirable just for having some unique features. They never really sold them as anything separate, as Century would do. They just kind of mixed them in with the rest. So those are the couple of options for a Polish milled gun today, again outside of just a custom build. Good guns. Up to this point, really all the guns we've looked at have been very close to the original Soviet pattern. Even that Polish gun is just modified a bit. But what milled AK overview would be complete without this gun here? The Valmet AK47. And this gun is interesting for many reasons. This is one of the few AK versions not to be produced in the comm block by a communist nation at a communist factory. Now, Finland and Russia fought first the Winter War and then the Continuation War in the 1940s and reached a peace, a conclusion. But it was uneasy, and Finland needed to rearm with modern equipment. They started looking at what to replace their aging Mosin Nagant based rifles with in the mid-50s, and started to get interested in the AK and doing something with the AK around 1957, 1958. They would first obtain some standard AK Type 3s. From where is a little bit of a debated point. Some say Russia, others say Poland. On the surface, the Polish answer makes more sense. Relations between Poland and Finland would have been better, and Poland would have probably been more willing to work with Finland compared with Russia. But either way, they obtained some actual AK Type 3s from them, still chambered for 7.62 39, and would designate these as the RK54. They would, have enough to do that. Actually, they would keep these in service for a long time, using them as training guns and, of course, reserve guns. Both the factories of Valmet and Mishaco would work with the AK platform, modifying it here and there, and this would result in the M60 prototypes. Now, the original M60 would have a wooden stock. The sights were a little different muzzle device, but at its heart it was still a milled AK. It would be put up against several other designs, including some from Switzerland, the US, Germany in 1962, and even a design from Mishaco. But the Valmet M60 would be updated to the M62 and would be selected for Finland's standard issue service rifle. They would continue to update it and modify it a little bit, and then put it into production in 1965. Like I said, this might not look like an AK, but it really is. It's just they changed it up a bit. We have a 16-inch barrel still, but we're not chrome lined. We have a very different muzzle device. It's actually pinned on. It's an open-ended 3-prong with a bayonet lug underneath for a blade bayonet. We have a combination front sight gas block, which many more modern AKs have started to use, including the Galil, of course. We have a hooded front post. This is windage adjustable with 2 screws, kind of like on a FAL. It slides back and forth in a dovetail. We do have a pretty standard AK pattern gas tube. It's smooth, but we're ported here on each side to let off the gas. The handguard is very unique. This is the original cheese grater pattern. Later they would go to a slightly more conventional look. This is bakelite with ventilations, held on by metal cap. There's not a cleaning rod under the barrel, as you see. We have a pretty standard AK bolt group in here. Same basic gas piston. Although they did add little fingers with some of the Valmets to keep it in the gas tube better, guided better, more centered. We have a standard AK safety. It's a little bit extended out here and the contours changed a bit, but it's pretty standard. The mag catch is the standard shape, but it's extended out to the side and it has this protector here in front of it. We're feeding from standard AK magazines, very, very close to Polish pattern, with one exception. We have a lanyard loop on the bottom. We have a pretty unique pattern of lightning cut on the side, on the bottom here, and on this side here. We have sling swivels. We have, well, not swivels exactly. We have a bar up here on the gas block and a corresponding bar on this buttstock. This buttstock is affixed to the receiver permanently. It is affixed. It's made from steel with a plastic or something cheek wrap, and we do have a storage compartment, actually quite a large one here. This comes up, hinges over. to store a sectional cleaning rod and such. The pistol grip is also quite unique. This is the original bicycle grip. It's very round. It's basically a metal grip with polymer synthetic overlay. We have a double hook trigger, but it's of a straighter design than on the Russian pattern. And we have a different rear sight. This latter is very similar to the Russian style here, but we have an actual hooded peep instead. We have two protective ears on it, and this also flips over to give a night sight. Now, these originally did not have night sights. They would introduce these in 67, 68, so a little into production. That flips over to give a night sight, and your front night sight is a flip up paddle here. And as I said, they would make other changes, such as updating the pistol grip and the handguard. They would also do a folding stock version that the military would buy in limited numbers. These would be, as like I said, on the milled receiver. Essentially, Valmet would make for the military a big, long production run beginning in 65 and ending around 75 for them in this pattern. And really, these are in service still today. Probably one of the longest serving milled AK types out there. There's the updated RK62M, of course, which is just this with more modern furniture. They did attempt to replace this with stamped receiver guns, first with the M71. The military did acquire a few, but decided they weren't strong enough. Next came the M76 with a more reinforced, more welds, more rivets receiver, a little heavier dutier. The military would actually acquire some of those, marking them, designating them as the RK62-76. But these would not see a lot of use. It seems like the ones that they acquired, they either put in reserve or they gave to very professional elite soldiers. I think they still thought the milled receiver was a better, more trustworthy thing to give to conscripts than the stamped. In the 80s, Valmet would go back to a milled receiver for quite a few of its guns. Most of them were sold commercially. A very similar pattern to this, except the lightning cuts would go away, so it has a slab side look. And then in 1986, I believe it was, Valmet started to close down its firearms division and get rid of the assets, many of which ended up at Seiko. Now, Seiko, even though their design lost the trials, would make RK62 parts and rifles for the military. And of course, just for completeness' sake, the last version would be the RK95TP, which is an updated version from the 90s that Seiko would do essentially on the same platform. They would make one big run of them, 20 some odd thousand, ending in 1998, and that was it. And so now Seiko's not making them, and Valmet gave up about a decade earlier. There's a lot to be said on this gun, that's why it's in its own videos, but I just had to bring it out with the milled guns. Just, it was a thing that had to be done. And it really is internally very Kalashnikov, even if the furniture is radically different. As to the semi-autos, these were the first AK pattern guns to come into the USA. Inner Arms and later Stoger would bring over semi-autos. First, this is the original version, the very first. The M62S would have the tube stock. Then they would introduce, because this didn't sell great, a wood stock version, somewhat similar to the M60 prototype wood stocks. And these would be replaced by the M71s, M76s, and then the later style mill guns. There's quite a few, but this pattern, they would only bring over 200 of this style and about 1,000 more of the woodstock style. So there's not many actual M62s, but there are some others in different styles, at least for the 7.62-39. Moving on, we have the Zastava. This is another gun that's a pretty radical take from the original Soviet. Yugoslavia was pretty late to get into a lot of the guns. They were quite late to get into the SKS. They did not adopt it until 1959, and that was when Russia basically just gave them the production line. At that point, 59, no one was wanting the SKS anymore for new production. So Yugoslavia would start off making that, and then they would begin experimenting with the AK. And today, collectors refer to these early experiments as the M64. This name isn't really supported by anything except just years and kind of what Zastava was doing. They were always unique guns. They took the design, but they made a lot of changes. The M64 differed from later versions like this, and then it had dual lightning cuts. It had a screw-in barrel as the original, and it had an automatic last round hold open. Well, this was a little expensive to produce, a little fidgety, and it meant it could not feed from standard AK mags. So next was the M70, and this kind of becomes the blanket term for all of the early guns. M70. And this is when the Yugoslavian military would officially adopt them as the AP M70. They would quickly go away from the screw barrel, though, and also drop the automatic last round hold open, and this would result in the M70B, and that's what I have here. This is a reweld. The M70B was the first really simplification for mass production. We've gone from the screw-in barrel to a press and pin-in, taken from the AKM, even though we still have a milled receiver. We have the lightning cut here, but we've deleted it from this side, so it's a very slab side look, very distinctive. Earlier there had been an underfolding version known as the M70A with a screw-in barrel, and of course there was an underfolding version of this known as the M70AB. So some features we have. We have a 16-inch barrel. This is the heavier profile of the AK Type 3. It's cold hammer forged but not chrome lined. Yugoslavia, even today Serbia, never did chrome line their 7.6239 barrels. Well, we're threaded 14x1, pretty standard there. But then our gas block is further forward on the barrel. We have flip up grenade sights which double as a gas cutoff. We still have a ported gas tube. If you notice it's shorter here, that's because we have a longer handguard than a standard pattern, so everything's moved up and a bit different. Sling Swivels still up here. They made their own pattern of sling even. The rear swivels on the back of the receiver. The buttstock does not have tangs. Instead, it goes into a socket on the receiver with a big screw running through it. We have a rubber butt plate, no storage, partially because of that big screw. We can't have storage. This rubber butt plate is for the grenade launching. We have a unique pattern of pistol grip. Early ones would be wood. Then we would have this polymer one with the metal ferrule on the top, and then later we would get rid of the ferrule and go to the more conventional grip that most of us know. Also for grenade launching, we have the spring-loaded detent. So that's pretty unique to this gun. That you press it in, you can take your dust cover off, and when you're done, you can just, and your dust cover is locked back on. The early milled guns would have a heavier gauge cover than the later stamped ones. And they would also start to add night sights to these quickly. Back here's one. Up here's one. And finally, we have the bolt hold open follower built into the magazine since we got away from that automatic. They wanted a hold open, so they added it to the magazine rather than the gun. This does allow it to take all standard AK mags, and that's what made them happy. People debate if these mags are useful, but either way. These are pretty heavy gauge steel mags. They feel a little chunkier than a standard rib mag. They also have a simplified rib pattern on the bottom. And these would be the first versions, both the screw-in and then the pressed and pinned-in versions. They would go into Yugoslavian service, and they would use the heck out of these. They would see use in their civil war. They would see export to other nations. Iraq was a big user of the M70. But they would soon transition over first to a 1.0 millimeter receiver, and then a 1.5 millimeter receiver with a bulged trunnion. This is what we know today as the M70B1, even though it should be called the M70B2. Long story. But really the whole front end is very little changed with those to the originals. They did relocate the ports and stuff, but you get the idea. These guns saw a lot of service and were produced in the early 70s. About where it is. It's definitely a unique pattern to Yugoslavia, who is known for doing its own thing. Even today, Serbia has its own way of kind of making guns. And there are no real pre-bands. There are some milled pre-bands that Mitchell's brought in, but they're quite uncommon, and they tend to be in the larger calibers like 8mm or 308 based on the M76. There's really, for practical purposes, no import milled guns. All the PAPs and stuff were on the stamped receiver. So if you want a milled Yugo, you're back to needing a kit gun. And for our final milled, we look at Bulgarians, and we actually have two out for a really good reason. Most nations got away from the milled receiver gun pretty early on, with Yugoslavia being, one of the last to really do it. Bulgaria got into it around 1958, started up production at the Arsenal factory, Circle 10, Factory 10. And for their 7.62 39 guns, they never really went away. To be exact, they never went to a stamped AKM type gun. Originally, their milled guns, of course, were copies of the Russian, both fixed and obviously underfolding. And this is my underfolding milled gun to show you. It's kind of one reason I have it. It only locks on this one side here. As you see, this side is just a hinge. We have rounded steel with a spring-loaded butt plate, and it has the down-swept angle. And this was the standard kind of pattern of underfolding stock used for most of the milled underfolding guns. Well, as time would go on, since Bulgaria kept making, Arsenal kept making the milled gun when everyone else was going to the stamped gun, some stamped features started to creep in to the design. As with the other newer made guns, we have a barrel that's pressed and pinned in rather than screwed. Our barrel assembly is still the same on this gun. It's still the medium heavy profile. This is a chrome lined. We take the standard AK Type 3 bayonet, standard 14x1 threads, standard 45-degree gas block, milled receiver. However, they would go to a new Finnish style inspired by the AKM. Rather than being blued, it would be a phosphate with a paint over it. And they would switch from wood furniture to synthetic. It's quite interesting. We would have Bakelite, or at least we call it Bakelite. It's really a AG4 fiberglass material, handguards. China would also use this style, not identical, but a similar style, but on their stamped guns. We would go to a synthetic soft plastic pistol grip, sometimes called a salmon color or pink. And for the fixed stock version, we would use a single piece buttstock made out of the same material. Even the butt plate had a ribbed butt plate, but it was made out of the same kind of salmon material. It's a very interesting stock, and it's solid too. Yeah, obviously much cheaper to make than wood, and probably more durable. Now, Arsenal would use stamped receivers for their AK-74 guns and 5.45. They would go over to that caliber. But for their 7.62, at least for military use, they would keep on using the milled receiver, adopting these modernizations and sometimes product improvements, sometimes just easier to make in the late 80s, early 90s. And after the fall of communism, this kind of set them apart. They really promoted the milled receiver. This is where a lot of the milled receiver pros seems to come from, is Arsenal in Bulgaria, when they started to market the semi-autos like this one over here. Oh, and I just put a Russian Bakelite mag in it because why not? Most of the time, early on, they would just use the standard ribbed mag, but by now we've had so many guns with it. We have a whole video on the semi-auto arsenals, so I'm not going to go much into it here. I will say there are no pre-banned Bulgarians. The first Bulgarian rifle to be imported was the SA-93, which was a banned version of their standard gun, standard AK Type 3 Modernized. Then they would start assembling guns from parts here on 80% Bulgarian receivers finished out here, and that's where this gun comes from. This is the SAS M7 Classic, and it's quite a faithful replica of the original. The reason I went with the modern handguards and pistol grip on this one is because the wood is really kind of anachronistic on this gun. When they were doing the wood, at least for the most part, they were still doing the blued finish and the screw-in barrels. When they went to the paint finish and everything, they went to the synthetic furniture for the most part. I did put a leather sling on it because why not? Bulgaria very well might be the only nation to still make milled receiver, at least select fire AKs, whereas everyone else got away from it. They went with it and took it for their own. They did the AK Type 3s. They also did RPKs and other guns. They even did some AKSU crank type guns on milled receivers, and they would do not only 7.62-39 but also 5.56 NATO. So kind of interesting. But I have this one here just to show you the pattern of stock, and like I said, 80s, early 90s production Bulgarian gun AK Type 3. And to wrap things up, we'll look at a modern production. After the fall of communism, Arsenal revamped the AK Type 3, AK47, into the AR-M series. First off was the AR-M1, which came in several different flavors. They introduced quite a few features from the AK-74 after having experience producing those. And then they would do a whole series. They would do M1, M2, M3, M6, M9, M12, so on and so forth. This is a copy of the M9. And this is a modern milled gun. It really is. Really the only one that exists. The barrel assembly is pretty much taken from the AK-74. We have a 16-inch hammer forged chrome line barrel, but it's of the lighter AKM, AK74 profile, lighter under the handguard especially. We take a standard AKM, AK74 bayonet. We have the lug under the sight base here, and we have an accessory lug for, say, a grenade launcher here. We have 24mm threads instead of 14. This is a unique Bulgarian birdcage flash hider. We have the 90-degree gas block, and this is pressed and pinned into the receiver as you would expect. So yeah, it's a essentially an AK-74 front end stuck on to a milled gun. The bolt group is pretty standard, double hook trigger. The receiver is pretty standard, except now we have a scope rail as well, standard. We also have a sling swivel that rotates 360 degrees back here on this model, and we have this block that is pinned and welded onto the receiver at the factory for this folding stock. It's a pretty unique stock. The hinge itself is again copied from the AK-74, although it's reversed to fold to the right instead of left, but the mechanism's the same. The stock itself is pretty unique. It's tubular steel, it's hollow with a rubber recoil pad. It uses a similar hook system to lock in as on the AK-74, well I should say AKS-74, but it's reversed and external. As you see, it's actually a button here. To go with it, we have a new pattern of polymer handguard. It's a very triangular shape for better heat dispersion. We have a new pattern of pistol grip. It's more rounded too. And we have new magazines made out of polymer with metal reinforcements, a waffle pattern. Interestingly, these mags are kind of a takeoff from Finland or vice versa, because Finland would go to a very similar magazine with the aforementioned RK95. Now the M9 variant specifically has a left side selector, pretty much taken off the Israeli Galil. Of course, in the military version, this would select the fire mode as well as safe. Semi-auto, it just does safe and semi. Other versions don't have this. The M1 still does not. So that's one of the options. And of course, they make a fixed stock version too, with a pretty unique stock. And again, this is not only current issue in the Bulgarian military, it's not necessarily standard. They use a few different guns, both in 7.62-39 and 5.56. They also sell these to quite a few customers abroad. And this is what's keeping the milled gun alive for so long. They've really promoted it. As I said, this is kind of their thing. And to be fair, a lot of the former communist factories are no longer making Kalashnikovs anyway. So the fact that Circle 10 still is pretty unique. As far as the semi-autos, we have, like I said, several videos, including specifically on this gun. This one, though, the SAM-7 SF, is brought over as a complete gun from Bulgaria. And then it's reworked with modern military features by Arsenal Incorporated. So this is a true Bulgarian built gun. It's not assembled here in the USA. So that's what I think is pretty neat about it and why I have that particular version. Well, that's my not so brief walkthrough of the different guns. I thought maybe you could see how similar and also how different they are, especially as you get kind of later on. The earliest guns are exact copies for all intents and purposes of the Russian, but as time would go on, they would start to diverge. This is pretty clear with the milled AK. If we do a video like this on the AK-74 though, you will see a much faster and more apparent divergence. There are some guns, as I said at the beginning, that I just won't own. We'll toss up some pictures now of what they are. There was, for example, the East German MPI-K, which was a milled gun. Again, it was very similar to the Russian. However, it used a different stock. It did not have a cleaning rod or storage for the cleaning kit in the stock, and it used its own hardwood furniture. They did not actually make these for very long. They're pretty uncommon and rare today. But it's one of the variants that are out there, and of course it has German quality to it. There's also the North Korean Type 58. And it is, again, really its own thing. It's very closely patterned after the early Chinese, which itself is patterned after the Russian. So it looks the same as any of the early guns, but of course being North Korean is extremely rare, even in kit form. I mean, kits bring multi-thousands. So probably not going to have one of those guys. And of course there are plenty of other sub-variants. Romania used the milled AK. However, they purchased rifles from Russia. They never set up their own production. At most, they might have made, say, furniture or small replacement parts. But they would not adopt it until the early 60s and very quickly would go to the stamped AKM, adopting it as the PM63. So there are some Romanian property guns, but they're still originally Russian. And likewise, there are other nations that would do that. Albania had a milled AK. Honestly, I don't know much about them. I know that they were helped by China to set up, so they have some similarities with Chinese. And I don't know how much was made of that gun in Russia or China versus Albania. So on and so forth. But I did my best to, share. There's also the Czech VZ58, which is not at all an AK, even though it is a milled gun, firing 7.6239. For it, check out any of our other videos based on it. And if any of these interest you, we have individual dedicated videos to either the semi-auto gun itself or the history of the whole AK family in that nation. But, as I said, I had all these guns, figured, why not, bring them out, show them. It's fun. Anytime you get to play with AKs is fun. Well, if you'd like to share your own, that'd be great. We'd love to hear about them in the comments. If you have any questions or would like to correct any mistakes I made, which I'm sure I made some because I'm just kind of winging it, please feel free to politely leave those. If you like the video, please click like and also check out our others. And if you have not already subscribed and could do so, we'd really appreciate that. This is Misha. And please tune in again soon for hopefully another unique, interesting video. We'll see you there.